what we would do well to do is to move sort of closer to saying what are the systems that are relevant for understanding psychosocial stressors and what are the dynamics, the regulatory logic or the mathematics of those systems. I think if we could characterize that, then we would probably have a much more concrete understanding of the physiology, and I think then we would be able to arrive at much more well-grounded theories of stress at the psychological level.
Welcome to the Stress Puzzle, where we explore the latest in stress science and consider how the science may translate to our daily lives or where we might have missing pieces for actually making that connection. I'm your host, Ryan Brown, and I'm a social health psychologist working with the Stress Measurement Network, which is a team funded by the National Institute on Aging and includes internationally recognized stress experts from UCSF, UCLA, and Yale. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. George Slavich, an associate director of the Stress Measurement Network. George does an excellent job of highlighting specific scientists, theories, and papers that might be of interest to listeners. But we don't want you to feel like you need to be taking notes or anything like that, so we've linked all of those references in the show notes for you. Specifically, we talked about the history of how stress exposures have been conceptualized, with a focus on key theories and perspectives around stressful life events, before we turn to the kind of research that will shape the next decade in stress science. We're joined today by Dr. George Slavich, who's a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCLA, where he's also the founding director of the Laboratory for Stress Assessment and Research. He has outstanding expertise and enthusiasm for bettering the conceptualization, assessment, and management of life stress, and for identifying the psychological and biological mechanisms that link stress to mental and physical health. George has received numerous awards for his research, mentorship, and teaching, and we're so happy that he brings this experience and passion for precision stress science to the Stress Measurement Network. All right, welcome, George. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited for this episode.
I've been really excited for this episode because it encompasses sort of the core purpose of the podcast, which to me really is to provide this historical context of where we are as a field to folks who might not have been there to see how we got here, like me. This is really motivated by a lot of my frustration with my own lack of knowledge as a grad student and, feeling like you're just reinventing the wheel of theories or ideas that have already been brought up. So I really hope that this and future episodes will support anyone who's interested in stress science to feel more knowledgeable about our history. And I can't think of anyone better to walk us through this history than George, who has both so much knowledge on the topic and is really engaging to hear from. You can really feel his passion for advancing stress science and knowing where we came from in our history. So, George, I would really love to hear your perspective on how stress science started and where you see it going.
Appreciate that, and I also love the title "Stress Puzzle," the Stress Puzzle, and honestly, I think the history of the conceptualization of stress is perfectly captured by this metaphor of a puzzle. Insofar as there seems like there are 1,000 different pieces, each piece has a different approach, a different framework, view on the conceptualization of stress, and we do in fact see that if we look back 200 years with all the key players that have been woven themselves into this fabric.
Absolutely. And even with our general difficulty of operationalizing the concept of stress and all of the different ways that we use the word stress is so subjective, almost as much as our individual experience of that stress.
Yeah, and I also always say that it's a blessing and a curse to be a stress researcher because, on the one hand, everybody knows what it is that you're talking about, and on the other hand, nobody knows what it is that you're talking about. Because, as you just said, when I say the word stress, I may conjure up in my mind the idea of a physiological response. When somebody else says the word stress, they may refer to some kind of life event like a divorce or hearing bad news or being physically attacked. And so we honestly see that colloquial use of the word stress play out in all the conflict and confusion that's present in the scientific literature.
Yeah, and it strikes me too that, our use of the word stress in the context of psychology or in medicine is really a lot more recent than I would have thought it was, and how much the idea of stress was really initially more focused on building and physical pressures, and then kind of transfers into things like temperature, pressure, or heat, that kind of stress. So it's interesting to see the development of this concept, and how far we've come to now this point where we have such a large focus on stress in the process of diseases.
I think that's both true in a lot of ways and untrue in some ways. If you look back at very early, Greek notions of stress, you do see a lot of examples of individuals who are struggling psychologically with the demands of both the psychological universe and the physical universe. I think what you're picking up on is that not not at all times during the course of human history have we been totally comfortable looking at ourselves in the mirror. I should say looking at
Mm.
our psychological selves in the mirror. And so I do feel that you're right on point that in sometimes we've sort of swung to this. Well, if it's not a physical stressor, then it's not relevant for human health and well-being. And at those time points, we have sort of focused on physical stressors as being the only things that, could impact the brain and the body. But there's no shortages of early roots of thinking about how the challenges, of the social environment impact mental health and well-being as well. It's really just that there are so many different traditions that are
Mhm.
woven together, and of course that the term is used so permissively as to essentially render itself totally useless.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you're saying there around part of that being really how much are we comfortable with confronting this idea? Something that has stood out to me in thinking about the history of stress, and especially in the context of war, and how much the world wars really shifted our focus on psychological stress, and visibility of the effects of psychological stress. It really is striking that those early, studies of things like shell shock initially were a little bit dismissed because there wasn't something you could physically point to, and so soldiers would be sent back into war. And I wonder if you see places, or if there are any pivotal moments in history that stand out to you as affecting how comfortable we are with acknowledging the psychological element
Are
of
we
health and
there yet?
disease.
Are we
Right.
there yet? Listen, I think we are, if we're to be totally honest with ourselves, I think we are absolutely not comfortable really looking stress in the eye because, like a lot of other things in psychology, once you identify it and recognize it as a problem, now presumably the onus is on you to resolve it, right? And we don't, as humans, always like the responsibility. There's a certain part of our psyche, I think, that wants to relinquish control to more macro factors or to the gods of the world, so that we feel like we don't have to be the one in charge of doing something about it.
Right.
And I love the examples that you gave. So as soon as you recognize that shell shock and PTSD are a thing, then all of a sudden it's the onus is on the military leaders and the mostly men in power to not send, our young men and women overseas to fight senseless battles. Once we recognize that the stress of a interpersonal relationship has been grinding on us for months or years, now we have to ask ourselves why we didn't get out of it sooner. If we're stuck in a high interest mortgage in a house that we love, but that's dragging ourselves down and our relationship down. Now the onus is on us to get out of the mortgage and make difficult decision of moving somewhere else. So I just think that life is rife with examples of how stress is complicated. And as soon as we say, yes, in fact, stress is terrible, by the way, not that it is always terrible. We will get into that soon, I imagine.
Mhm.
But once we realize that, the negative life events or chronic stressors are problematic, now all of a sudden we have the responsibility to do something about it. And that responsibility is something that we don't always like to have.
I am so glad you have pointed to that piece of the responsibility really being a barrier to acknowledging, and then, what do we do about it? So really great point. And to zoom in a little bit more on one of your areas of expertise, especially, could you just speak a little bit to how we've historically measured or considered major life events like maybe being in battle or divorce, something like that.
Yeah, that's probably a five episode series. So we'll try to condense it here.
Perfect.
For as many players as there have been in the history of stress research, really broadly conceptualized, there are as many perspectives and definitions. So I think just to get that uh, off the bat, there is very little consistency, which I talk a lot about in my writing, around different conceptualizations of stress. I would say that the rule of thumb is that there's general disagreement and non-overlapping definitions. So we can, go back to sort of modern thoughts, about stress, and that's, let's say, around the mid to late 1800s. We have the early origins thinking about Charles Darwin and Claude Bernard. They were really the first to describe in any scientific sense how it is that humans and other mammals, other organisms, really the part of the ongoing challenge, the life course is this adaptation to ever changing
Mhm.
environmental circumstances. So, of course, that's, when we think about stressors, right, you have a psychological or physical stressor, and now the organism has to adapt. And then later on, we think about, in the late 1890s, there's Sir Clifford Albute, who talked about how the modernization, the industrial revolution were really impacting people's psyches, causing nervousness, disability, hysteria, frightfulness. And then the turn of the century, 20th century, Walter Cannon is really talking, I think, for the first time about how emotions really have specific physiological consequences. So in some ways, we don't maybe think of Cannon as like a prototypic stress researcher, but he really brings into this narrative the connection between thoughts and emotions and physiology. And of course, as stress researchers, we care a lot about how our thoughts and emotions affect our physiology and in turn impact health. And that really
Mhm.
sets the stage for, one of the key players, I would say, in kind of the classic models and frameworks around stress, which of course is Hans Selye. And there's a
Mhm.
lot of reasons why Selye is so impactful even on our current thinking of stress. First of all, he was extremely prolific. He wrote 39 books on stress and related topics. He published almost 2,000 articles. So by any standards,
Wow.
he would have had an incredible impact. But his work was also very experimental, very careful, and in some ways, he did the most to advance stress research. And I would say in some ways, he also did the most to hamper our current understanding. And the reason that I
Mm.
say that is because he's really famous in part for saying, that stress is the non-specific response of the body to any demand, and that
Mm.
stressors are quote unquote that which produces stress. And sort of this circular reasoning
Mhm.
really, I think, has pervaded our thinking today. We don't have clear boundaries between stressors and stress, and defining stressors as anything that produces stress, is something challenging to grapple with. And the biggest problem is really just his non-specific conceptualization of the stressor construct, and that has really lingered. We generally still talk about stressors as all having an equivalent impact on physiology, and we do not do a good job of identifying different types or dimensions of stressors that might have different physiological consequences.
Mhm. I haven't seen that connection drawn between how Celia originally conceptualized this and the problems that are sort of plaguing our field now, but I think it's a really apt description. And one thing that came up for me when I was thinking about this episode and reading back on these figures, given how much we link stress to, something like IBS or general stomach issues, I found it really interesting that Walter Cannon's son, in writing the biography for Walter Cannon, was writing about how Cannon was really interested in peristalsis and was studying that, wave-like motion and how that became disturbed when a cat was distressed or alarmed. And so that idea of emotional effects on internal functions and how many of these early studies of stress were not necessarily focusing on stress, but another process, and the way that you go about handling or animals really highlighted the way stress is affecting their physiology. That has just been standing out to me since we talk so much about, IBS girlies and the stress there.
Yeah, what strikes me about that comment is that I think we'd probably do well to make our current approaches in stress research more physical, more mathematical. We have so many of these conceptualizations, sort of after the days of Cellier, Holmes and Ray, Seligman approach, Lazarus and Folkman. We can talk about all these. They're sort of striking to me in the sense that they mostly okay, well, these are all very smart people, so no disrespect intended. But, we've all done, myself included, a lot of armchair theorizing. It's sort of, taking a step back and trying to imagine what the contours of psychological stressors are
Mhm.
without, let's say, much, mathematical reasoning behind it. I mean, actually, part of that is sort of was my impetus of, introducing social safety theory.
Mhm.
I'm not a mathematician, and not to be misleading, there is no math in social safety theory. But what I tried to do there was sort of think
Which
about
might be why I like
the
it so much.
well, yes, that's me too. Uh, but I guess what I'm trying to say is
Yeah.
that I did in to my own capacity take a step back and imagine what is the internal regulatory logic of the
Mhm.
human brain and the human immune system. And I'm sure that the brain and the immune system both do have its mathematical principles. Thinking of that is beyond my capacity. But I do think like what we would do well to do is to move sort of closer to saying, what are the systems that are relevant for understanding psychosocial stressors, and what are the dynamics, the regulatory logic or the mathematics of those systems. And
Mhm.
if I think if we could characterize that, then we would probably have a much more concrete understanding of the physiology, and I think then we would be able to arrive at much more well-grounded theories of stress at the psychological level.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So essentially, you're saying that we don't have as great of an understanding of, without stressing someone out or without chronic stress, what is the sort of the mathematical governing principle of these systems? And then in stressful conditions, how does that disrupted potentially?
A few years ago, I wrote a tongue-in-cheek paper in the journal Brain Behavior and Immunity called Stressnology. And this, for me, this metaphor does a lot of work. So obviously, stressnology is a play on the word phrenology. And if we go back, what was phrenology all about? It was essentially, this study of human personality by feeling and measuring the external contours of the human skull. So essentially, I think that's what we've been doing in stress research for a long time. We've had very poor measurement of stress as a construct. And as a result of that, we've only been measuring the external contours of the stress construct. And as a result, we have theories and definitions of stress that are only as sophisticated as our measurement tools allowed. So in
Oof.
phrenology, of course, you're measuring the contours of the skull. So how on earth could you do any degree of accurate brain mapping? Right? You
Mhm.
fast forward 150 years, now you have structural and functional fMRI, and you see how far human brain mapping has come in a period of 20 years.
Mhm.
We don't have these totally ungrounded, silly notions of the way in which the brain is organized, either structurally or functionally. So, I argue in that tongue-in-cheek the stressnology paper that, essentially stress research needs its fMRI moment, right? If you can't
Mhm.
if you can't image the stress construct in high resolution, then the theories that we will inevitably have about about the dimensions, the contours, the nature, sort of the human brain mapping version of the stress construct, then they will be really poor. And we see this in sort of the last, I don't know, 70 to 80 years of all of the different ways in which we have defined the important aspects of stress just based on associations between life events and a variety of outcomes,
Mhm.
while totally ignoring the biological dynamics that underpin those associations. I think that has something that's really hampered our progress.
Yeah, and I really want to go towards theory in one moment, but something that you were saying there at the end really stands out to me because I've been really excited to see more and more work really considering much more of the interplay of how biology may also be influencing psychology, right? We've done the other way around for a while, but seeing folks be thinking about how inflammation may be affecting social experiences or behaviors, or affiliative behaviors, work coming out of Keely Muscatel's lab. I think that gets us a lot closer to a, a more responsive and responsible consideration of these factors that are playing together, even if we're usually looking at them only in one direction.
Yeah, I love you giving a shout out to Keely's work. She's just one of my favorite investigators, and her work is fantastic. Yeah, it's funny how we're so good at not always bringing our personal experience into our work. So, think back to the last time that you had the flu, or maybe you had COVID symptoms. The link between our biology and our thoughts, emotions,
Hmm.
and motivation is is painted all over our personal lives.
Hmm.
When we're sick, we might feel anxious, we might feel hypervigilant, we're probably pain sensitive. Usually we don't like engaging in social affiliative behaviors. We seclude ourselves. We're not motivated, we don't want to seek out fun things, we're mostly anhedonic. We we're not don't feel sexual. All these quote unquote sickness behaviors are totally adaptive. If
Hmm.
you have a communicable disease, then it's best for the herd for you to not be socializing.
Hmm.
To not be motivated to socialize, because you shouldn't pass that communicable pathogen onto other people. And also, there's of course the benefits of general malaise for recuperation and recovery. So all of these sensations and motivations, that change dramatically when you're ill. But I totally agree that we've mostly studied kind of top down regulation of immunity, much more so than we've studied sort of immune regulation of psychology and behavior.
Hmm.
And at the end of the day, it's both, right? These
Absolutely.
It's not one direction or the other. I think we really need to understand both directions.
Mhm. And let's dive into some theory for a minute. One of your last responses just really led into a lot of the questions that I was excited to chat with you about. So, if you can talk us through some background on really the foundational or historical stress theories and how they've interacted with one another or changed over time. And then I have a couple follow up questions after that.
Love it. This is like one of my favorite lists to go down.
Perfect.
So, we're just gonna make this fun. We're gonna rattle off, a few famous last names, and then we're just gonna talk about, what's the central dimension or
Mhm.
feature that is associated with those famous last names. Okay, are you
Mhm.
you ready?
We're so ready.
All righty. Okay. Holmes and listeners can play along. Okay. So, Holmes and Ray, right? They looked at the magnitude of association between, a list of a ton of different life events and illness onset. I believe originally in tuberculosis. Okay. So what did they come up with? The key dimension is change and upheaval, right?
Mhm.
Those life events that presumably involved the most change got rated the highest score. So, you go down this checklist, you check the number of life events on the screener that you've experienced. Each one of those life events has a quote unquote change score. associated with it. And after that, so you have 5 life events, you do a summation of the change scores associated with all of them, and that's your quote unquote stress score. Sure enough, that's so the more change upheaval you have in your life, the more stress you've experienced.
Mhm.
Okay, what about Marty Seligman? Controllability, escapability, right? Marty Seligman, especially in the 70s and 80s, he was doing this work that was leading to these helplessness theories of depression that turned into helplessness slash hopelessness theories of depression, along with Mayer and Weiss. He really tried to say that those stressors that are less controllable, less escapable, were at the heart of what makes particular stressors more versus less stressful. We come back to California and the Bay Area. We have Lazarus and Folkman. They're really talking about situational demands of stressors interacting with an individual's ability to adequately cope, right? So you have more situational demands, but somebody who can cope really well with them, they may be more resilient, but then you have more situational demands and inability to cope. Okay, that's going to be probably lead to less resilience and more
Mhm.
illness. And then there are a few people who are not necessarily stress researchers, but I think their concepts have been really impactful for the conceptualization of stress, like Aaron Beck, the father of CBT and cognitive theory. He had these ideas around life events, stressors, and he binned them into interpersonal versus achievement. So interpersonal stressors, involving like intimate relationships, achievement stressors, sort of work-related stressors or education-related stressors. And he brought in the really interesting idea, which is kind of a diathesis stress idea, that a person's likelihood of breaking down is going to be increased when the nature of the stressor maps onto a person's specific cognitive vulnerability. So, for example, getting fired is going to be the most worse for somebody who has negative core beliefs that lead them to be rejection sensitive. So
Mhm.
getting fired in general is bad, but if we're talking about like the magnitude of the association between getting fired and the onset of depression, then the person who has the negative cognitive schema that they're not good enough is going to be more likely to become depressed when they're fired compared to the person who doesn't have that negative cognitive schema.
Mhm.
And okay, I'll just mention two more. Paul Gilbert, who I also don't necessarily think of as a card carrying stress researcher, but who's done, some of the most elegant work. I think the thinking, he focuses a lot on social conflict, competition, and the importance of social psychological characteristics of interpersonal stressors. Stressors are stressful if they reduce or have implications for social status, social rank, value, or regard. Talks a lot about, defeat. That is also a construct, I think, that has come up a lot in animal model work over the years. And then we have George Brown and Terrell Harris, who developed one of the most high quality systems for assessing stressors called the Bedford College Life Events and Difficulties Schedule, or LEDS for short. And they really
Mhm.
had Brown and Harris had this concept of cognitive upheaval or disruption um, in relation to an individual's goals, plans, or aspirations for the future. So if you have a life event that really throws the top off of its axis and requires the person to sort of reconceptualize and reorient their goals, plans, and aspirations for the future, then those are the types of stressors that are most stressful.
Mm. And I'm wondering how and which of these theories have really informed your work the most. And I guess another sort of piece of this question that is maybe a more critical view of some of these theories that because I think about I'm going to come back to the question of how it's affected your work because this was just kind of bubbling in my head as you were speaking, which is that in our intro psych classes or early in grad school classes you learn about these theories but you don't always hear exactly how people are thinking about them more in the more like updated modern sense. And so I wonder if there are any theories that you would point to as still really relevant to be considering, or any that you would say we've updated them and you can look in this direction now.
I love that question. So here's the problem. The problem is that, and I'll come back to why this is an issue. The problem is that all these theories are totally right. They're totally right. And the reason for that is that in stress research in particular, but I think in psychology more generally speaking, we almost always run confirmatory analyses and we almost never run disconfirmatory
Mm.
analyses.
Hmm.
Another way of saying it is that we often never, is that, can we say that? We often never test the boundaries of effects.
Yeah.
Another way of saying it, if you prefer, is that we never do sensitivity analyses.
Hmm.
So how does that impact kind of the conceptualization of stress, right? Let's say that you have this idea that that work stressors are very impactful. So you use a life events scale that assesses work stressors, and sure enough, you find that the more work stressors somebody has experienced, or the greater severity of those work stressors, the more likely somebody is to become depressed. So, sure enough, you've confirmed your a priori hypothesis that work stressors are in fact associated with your outcome of choice, and the more work stressors you have, the more the worse people are. Now, what's the problem? Of course, I mean, all the listeners already know all the problems, right? What you've confirmed your hypothesis, but you haven't said anything useful about whether work stressors are more or less relevant for that outcome as compared to literally the inverse of work stressors, which is anything else that somebody could have experienced.
Right.
So you've confirmed it, but you haven't really advanced the theory in any I would say usable way, because it doesn't tell us the relative import of work stressors versus all the other things that are stressors. And, so that's focusing on like a life domain of stress, but a life domain of, what I call primary life domains. But you can focus on characteristics as well. So, for example, let's say you take the Holmes and Ray approach, and you really think that it's about the change or upheaval. So now you take all the life events that you've assessed and you give them a change or upheaval score. So then you see that, the more change somebody's experienced, the more likely they are to get ill. I guarantee you that the correlation is moderate, to strong. Why? Because a lot of stressors that we think are important actually do involve a lot of change. So take a divorce, for example, right? You get
Hmm.
divorced, a lot of things change. Your relationship changes, your finances change, where you live might change, your housing situation might change, a lot of things change. But you haven't assessed other social psychological characteristics of
Hmm.
divorce. So now again, you reify the idea that change is at the heart of the matter. And I would say, if I look at divorce from the perspective of the immune system or the brain, I've made this argument, so I don't think that the brain, or I don't think that the immune system in particular is coding or listening to degree of change. The brain probably is much more so than the immune system. But my
Hmm.
point is that there are other characteristics of a divorce that may, in fact, and I'm not trying to say that it is in fact, but may in fact be more important or a
Hmm.
stronger predictor of whether or not people get ill than change. But if you don't measure other social psychological dimensions, again, then you will reify this idea that change is in fact what's most important, or change is in fact important. But again, you haven't compared it to other dimensions that, as I said, may lie at the heart of what makes people ill.
Oh my gosh. If we could have every intro psych class have this kind of a discussion, man, would we
They're
feel
all
better by the
correlated,
end
right?
of.
They're correlated. So I also was, I want to underscore that it's a complicated issue, right? Because change is correlated with other features or dimensions of stressors. So
Mhm.
that's in part, but we don't assess all of them. A lot of people, we focus. We have scales we like, so that the learnings that we get sort of are consistent with the scales that we use, because it's hard to assess all aspects of stressors, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some measurement issues, some measurement challenges embedded in that problem as well.
Well, and this might be a naive or too idealistic kind of question, but essentially, what do we do about that? Is the world of unmeasured social psychological experiences so vast that this is sort of a problem we're always going to have, or how can we better our science in this way? You mentioned sensitivity analyses, and I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts on this.
Did you think I might have some thoughts? Yeah, I absolutely do. So, George Brown and Trill Harris developed, as I mentioned, this interview-based system for assessing acute life events and chronic difficulties, and as I said, that's called the LEAD. So, if you're using the LEAD system, then this is how it looks. You have a 24-page interview. You sit down with a patient or a participant. You go through this 24-page interview. Takes a minimum of about an hour and a half, but more likely somewhere between an hour and a half and 2 hours. You then spend another hour to 2 hours summarizing all of that information in detailed vignettes. And then you spend another hour to 2 hours presenting each of those acute life events and chronic difficulties that the person has experienced to an independent panel of rater who consult a 524-page manual, during which time they are comparing the context and the severity of the life events that your participant experienced to pre-rated case vignettes that enable the raters to come to essentially grounded judgments of severity for the stressors that your participant experienced, in a way that enables standardization across interviews and cases.
Mhm.
Now, if you started sweating just thinking about how many hours
I was like, our
it takes
sample
per
size is
participant.
3.
Yes. So that's great, by the way, because if you have a sample size of 3, then you can actually use the system, because you're looking at about 8 to 9 hours,
Mhm,
just to rate one person. So, therefore, a sample size of 3 gets you to 24 hours of coding, which is actually doable.
mhm.
But now scale your sample size to, like, the sample size that any of us care about, which is
Right.
like, in the hundreds or 200s. And all of a sudden, you can't afford that system. I
Right.
mean that literally. Like, you
Yeah.
need an R01 just to implement the system.
Mhm,
So actually, the LEDs does get you a high resolution photograph of recent life stressors, but it comes at an enormous expense. And that was really the impetus for me developing the stress and adversity inventory, or strain.
mhm.
I ran into this problem where, I couldn't even afford to use the LEDs in my own research because, as I said, you need an R01 just to implement the stress measurement. The
Mhm,
other thing that was, I would say, shocking to me is that I was putting in all of that effort and only getting an assay of stressor exposure over the past year to 2 years.
mhm,
And that didn't comport with my idea that the impact of stress on the brain and the body is cumulative over a
right.
much, much, much longer period of time. So if you're looking to predict onset of depression or onset of anxiety disorders, you might be able to make the argument that recent life stressors are what matter most. But actually, I would immediately play devil's advocate and say, what are you trying to say? That early life stressors don't matter? Or
Right.
that, that nasty divorce that happened, so you're 50 years old, that terrible divorce that happened to you when you were 35 years old. Do you mean that that really terrible experience when you're 35 isn't relevant for your likelihood of becoming depressed at 50? I I
Right.
find that hard to believe. So,
You know,
what was really shocking to me is that we are spending so much time and effort to use this high resolution system, and we were ignoring the vast majority of people's lives.
yeah,
And,
absolutely.
that was really the strongest push for me to say, okay, what we need is a conceptualization of lifetime stressor exposure and a system for assessing a large variety of different types of stress over the person's entire life course. And moreover, that assay of lifetime stress exposure needs to be able to provide a high resolution panoramic photograph of all the major life events and chronic difficulties that a person has experienced in a relatively short period of time. P.S. It's hard to do. So,
I'm glad you did the
what we
labor for us.
yes, yeah,
Thank you for
uh,
that.
I did. By the way, mentorship note, it's not a great career move, right? Because you put your head down for 15 years, and for 15 years, you're developing a system, but you don't have, many or any publications to show for it.
Mm,
So, I guarantee you that for the early career folks in the room here, that you won't get a lot of brownie points for doing that work, and you only realize the benefit of it until several years later. But I
mhm,
think what we've done now, which was the goal is what I like to say is democratize the expert assessment of lifetime stressor exposure. We have a system. It takes about 18 minutes. You can get, as I said, a lifetime assay of stressor exposure based on the strain. You have about 445 raw variables that you can then crunch the numbers using, standard scripts we have to get about 115 different lifetime stressor exposure summary scores. So if you don't care about the nuances of stress and don't want to look into the nooks and crannies of people's lives, which you may not, and that's fine. So then you can focus on the strain's main variables, which is total count of lifetime stressors or total severity of lifetime stressors. But to the extent to which you think, like I do, that it really does matter whether those stressors involved interpersonal loss versus physical danger versus entrapment versus role change or disruption, or versus deprivation versus threat,
mhm,
whatever your conceptualization is, you can pull out variables that will focus just on those dimensions.
mhm.
And what I think is really important for the field as a whole is that then you can compare and contrast what I call, stress signals, whatever you want to refer to them as, with one another. And you can both do your confirmatory analyses, just like you always hoped, but you can also try to understand the boundaries of those effects and do disconfirmatory analyses as well. So that enables you to say, for example,
Mhm.
that interpersonal stressors are really important, but you can compare the magnitude of your favorite stressor to other stressors that you don't like as much, and then you can I think you know provide information that really moves the ball forward much more.
Yeah, it really strikes me that how incredible that would be as an exercise in a research methods class, for example, just to be able to go through that process in your training more specifically. Man,
think,
and
ab- think
oh
about
yeah,
it think about if you had an fMRI machine that could only image the amygdala.
hmm
you know it's
hmm
like the amygdala, we would find that the amygdala is involved in everything, right?
right, most important
We would
thing.
just Yeah, we would just, it's like, okay, under some conditions, amygdala activity is low. In other conditions, it's high. But if you could only image the amygdala, the whole story, the whole story of human nature would all be amygdala driven, right? So again, you confirm that the amygdala is implicated, but
hmm
but you don't you but you're not testing the boundaries of that, right? And you're
Right.
certainly not looking at the relevance of the amygdala to all of the other thousands of systems that are also engaged during a particular task.
hmm Yeah, since I mean, the strain really did fill such a critical gap in stress research and really capturing that lifetime stress experience and specific events. And I'm wondering if there are any other areas that you see now where we have similar critical gaps in our knowledge, either mechanistically, measurement wise, or in our ability to translate research to actually influencing people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. What I would say is that we now have the ability to do a lot of deep biological profiling. There's a field, there's an approach coming online. Some of you may have heard of it, called multiomics. Multiomics involves assaying, uh, every word that ends in omics. So, metabolomics, lipidomics, genomics, uh, these uh, transcriptomics. Now it almost sounds Theranos-like, so forgive me, but with a relatively small sample of blood, in many cases, even dried blood spots, you can now subject those samples
Wow, yeah.
to these multiomics approaches. And what that gives you is a 300,000 variables plus or minus 100,000 that enable you to look at metabolomic functioning, lipidomic functioning, genomic functioning, transcriptomic functioning, all these different systems that have units of analysis, if you like, that are relevant. Now, how many of us have applied a multiomics approach? Well, probably very few. And the reason for that right now is, well, A, you might not know about it.
Hmm.
Totally fair. B, even if you do know about it, it's extremely costly. So
Hmm.
although the prices have come down quite a bit, um, doing a full proteome analysis still costs, let's say, $800 to $900 per sample. So for most of us, that's
Yeah,
extremely pricey.
yeah,
We're
very
thinking
limiting.
about like the $30 to $50 range would be great or
Hmm.
cheaper. So, $800 is not scalable, even $100 is not very scalable. So, to your question about like what aren't we doing that we could be doing, I think the next 10 years looks like much more highly sophisticated biological profiling
Hmm.
as the cost of these technologies comes down, therefore making them available not just to kind of card carrying biomedical researchers or geneticists who, on average are more well funded than, social scientists are. Um, when the costs come down, what I'm trying to say, when the costs come down, then, they'll those approaches will be more usable, more feasible
Hmm.
for us folks in the social sciences, psychology, psychiatry, who also have a lot of other things that are expensive, like setting up a longitudinal cohort and doing interviewing people at multiple time points, which also
Hmm.
of itself is pretty costly. So I think that's what we're missing. We still focus on a few number of analytes,
Hmm.
and that's a great start. But I think that we'll have a much more sophisticated view of biology going forward.
Yeah, it will be so exciting in this next decade to really see that expand and hopefully get a lot cheaper. So, George, as we're wrapping up, what do you hope people will be able to take from the stress puzzle into their research lives, into the classroom, or into how they navigate stress in their own lives?
You got me with the last one. Okay, so you've given me the easy task of speaking literally to anything and everything. So thanks for that. Okay, so in your professional lives, I will say that your empirical work and the learnings or the discoveries that you will yield from your empirical work will be naturally limited by the quality of your methods for assessing stressor exposure. And what I mean by that is that if you're using a very short scale for assessing stress experience or stress exposure, then you will in fact have very limited things that you can say about the nature of how uh, different stressors are related to one another, as well as whether or not some stressors are more impactful for your mechanisms or mediators or outcomes as compared to different stressors. And I think that is, of I don't think that we need any more research on the fact that stress is impactful. I think we know that. That's clear. I think now we need to further refine and advance our theories around stress. And so I'm really making the argument for using systems for assessing stressors, whether it's the strain or other systems that are much more high quality. The second thing I'll mention, which again we all already touched on, is not just to look, um, where you've shined the light, but to move the flashlight around and to look at other constructs, other risk factors that we all know are also implicated. So, when we talk about life events, don't just look at the life events you think are most important, but
Hmm.
compare and contrast those life events to others. And again, sort of just to the point of improving theory, I think when you compare and contrast different predictors slash stress signals, that again will do much more for advancing our conceptualization and theories of stress than the approach of just looking where you've always been looking this whole time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's probably other comments, but I would say those are the two, good places to start. And, of course, if you want to know more about that, or if you're looking, for a motivated partner in that work, then, feel free to ping me. What can I say about personal stress experiences? I think that, especially in the United States, we, to differing degrees, all wear stress as a badge of honor. And, in some ways, I think that's an indication of just how resilient we are as a culture. We, tend to be individualistic. We tend to feel very empowered and efficacious. We tend to believe, on average, that, if we just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and tackle something head on, that, we can get through it. And I think, again, that doesn't describe all of us, but, if we look at other cultures, we're pretty high on those dimensions. I think there's a pro and con to that. I think the pro is that we can get a lot done. We sort of, can be highly productive. The con is that just because we're productive doesn't mean that productivity doesn't come at a cost.
Mm-hmm.
It may mean that we persist despite experiencing a lot of chronic stress that can cause wear and tear or allostatic load on our system. And we may not see the downsides of that allostatic load relatively early in our life because we don't have a lot of preclinical disease processes going on. We're not in our 40s yet, and sort of, you can still manage to sleep, 5 or 6 hours a night and get up and go at it again. But there's collateral damage that is occurring under the hood that, once you turn 50, 60, and 70 will begin to rear its ugly head. And so I apologize for the monologue here, but so I think as a culture, what my hope is that we start to have kind of a more fair and balanced or informative view of stress, which acknowledges both the upsides of having a, moderately filled, challenging, or stressful life, but we also are fair and honest with ourselves about the cost of that, not just to our interpersonal lives, like, how do our relationships potentially suffer when we work all the time or when we're stressed, but, how our biology might be suffering as well, even if we're not experiencing the somatic symptoms. Now we put ourselves at increased risk for developing those symptoms later on. So I guess the point being, let's get past wearing stress as a badge of honor, and let's start to prioritize other things like, purpose, meaning, and joy, time outside, time spent with friends, certainly family, and other things that are enjoyable and make us feel purposeful and love life, beyond just work and things that give us that energetic experience of stress.
Absolutely. That is a great message to end on. And George, thank you so much for joining us. It's really, really wonderful to get to hear your perspective on where we've come from and where we're going. And, I know you've gotten me excited about the next decade. So I know that there will be lots of other folks out there who are getting inspiration and motivation to continue down this path. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Reach out anytime, any of you out there in the radio universe, and wish you all the best onward and upward.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Stress Puzzle. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on any issues we've covered today. You can email us at stresspunzlepod@gmail.com, and you can also send requests for topics or guests for future episodes. The best way you can support the show is by leaving 5-star reviews wherever you listen to our podcast and sharing with your friends or your collaborators. And until next time, we're wishing you good stress and opportunities for rest.